For at least 200 years, the chessboard has been the dominant metaphor for understanding our global affairs. Statesmen and foreign policy experts scrutinize the actions and reactions of rival states, seeking to infer insights about their future behavior from their past. In the 1960s, Thomas Schelling's seminal book, The Strategy of Conflict, explained the theoretical basis of this interstate bargaining. And during the 1970s, Henry Kissinger emerged as a kind of geopolitical grandmaster, particularly in navigating U.S. relations with China and the Soviets during the Cold War. Political scientists like Joseph Nye describe the post-Cold War era as a complex three-dimensional chessboard divided between military, economic, and non-state power. But does this chessboard view of the world offer the best way of tackling today's global challenges, like climate change, terrorism, and pandemics? Is the most appropriate approach in a world of massive technological disruption, the growth of transgovernmental and private networks and hyperconnectivity, really one where we use a chessboard? As we enter the network age, might it not be better to rethink foreign policy and move away from statecraft to webcraft? And what are the ways to move from a zero-sum battle to the death world of chess to a positive-sum equation of the web? Welcome to the Phil Lind Initiative series on the unraveling of the global liberal order, hosted by the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at UBC. I'm Robert Muggah, this year's Phil Lind Fellow and your host of the podcast. And to help us understand and navigate the power and potential of webcraft, we're joined by Anne-Marie Slaughter. Anne-Marie is one of the preeminent international relations scholars of our time. She is president and CEO of New America, the former director of policy and planning at the U.S. State Department, and a former dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. She's also author of the newly published The Chessboard and the Web, Strategies of Connection in a Networked World. Anne-Marie, welcome.
Thank you.
There is a lot to talk about today. But before we dive into global power politics, network politics, and the rest, I want to hear a little bit more about you. You have this phenomenal combination of academic experience, policy experience, all the while managing a thriving family. And you sparked a global debate in your much celebrated article in The Atlantic and your book about the challenges of managing all of that. What is the takeaway today, all these years later, from that episode in your life?
I published that article in The Atlantic, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, in 2012. And 6 years later, I still think probably I'm better known for that than I ever will be for foreign policy. Indeed, when The Chessboard and the Web came out, I had a couple interviewers say to me, "This is quite an interesting departure for you, writing about network theory." Here I've been writing about networks since 1994, but of course, to someone who was introduced to me through the lens of gender politics, why would I write about global politics? But I will say that it's been hugely rewarding in that there is nowhere I go that a woman does not come up to me and talk to me about the impact that article had on her life. And, in the end, if you think about making a difference in the world, I didn't expect that. I didn't even intend it. I intended to reopen a conversation about gender equality, but I find myself thinking I was granted a gift to have it go viral and have an impact. I'll also say there's a connection between gender and network thinking. Mm-hmm. It's not one that I draw. The Chessboard and the Web is not about gender, but when I talk about how you see the world, do you see it as a chessboard or do you see it as a web? People who are under 35, so the digital natives, get it completely, whether male or female. They've grown up in a hyper-connected world. And women tend to get it automatically because we've rarely had vertical power. We've only had horizontal or networked power. And so I've thought quite a bit about that connection and just was I more sensitized to some of this writing this book after thinking very hard about gender and ultimately about valuing care.
That's really interesting because I felt that when reading your book, you present these two ideas of the Homo economicus, who's sort of the self-interested actor, and the Homo socialis, who's the more, let's call it, the actor more desiring more connection, collaboration, and belonging. And it struck me also in your references to scholars and to leaders throughout your book, it's a much more gender-balanced sort of representation of the world, I felt, than many of the other books on issues of global power that I've read in the past. So I was curious, this juxtaposition of these two stylized versions of the human, coupled with the references to gender, I was wondering if maybe there was some crossover from your work on gender and since 2012, and also your latest thinking around global networks.
Very much so. I mean, there's been a tradition in international relations, at least as long as I've been a scholar, pushing back against rational choice, thinking of human beings and then states as rational actors, unitary actors who engage in interest-based calculation. And interestingly, a lot of women were part of that pushback. So if you think of Marty Finnemore and Catherine Sickink, the whole movement of constructivism, but it was wait a minute, the way people behave is shaped much more by socialization than calculation. And that's been there for a while. There was a gender dimension, but people didn't bring it out exactly like that. When I wrote a book after my Atlantic article, a book it's called The Unfinished Business, Women, Men, Work, Family, I went deeply into neurobiology and evolutionary biology and became completely convinced that all human beings have a kind of competitive, goal-oriented individual side and a connected, belonging relationship side. And I don't actually think all women are on one and all men are on the other. I'm deeply competitive. I think society has sort of put women in the caring, connected side and men in the individual, goal-directed agency side. But in fact, we both have both. And that we need to think about our environment, whether that's local or global, taking account of both. So from that point of view, absolutely, Homo economicus is that same rational actor. Frankly, only men could have come up with that because only men had the luxury of being disconnected, right? It meant somebody was taking care of your bodily needs and letting you think about your goals, whereas women have not had that luxury and are much more attuned to the web of relationships that many times they were trapped in. But again, I think we need to think about both.
Let's think about it then. Tell us about webcraft. What is this idea that you've posited, and how is it different than the more traditional statecraft? I mean, following from your analogies. And how does it differ from your transgovernmentality ideas that you had been pushing back in the 1990s when I was a student?
Yes. So the starting point, the easiest way to grasp it is statecraft. When you look at the world, you see a map of some 200 states, all those different colors. And when you imagine the international system, because of course it's only in our head, there is no thing out there that is the international system. There are institutions like the United Nations and the World Bank, etc. But when we imagine it with those 200 players, or most of us imagine it with about 50 or 20 players, depending. That's one vision of the world, and that is the chessboard. You think about those nations competing generally for advantage. Sometimes they cooperate, but it's a limited number of states, and it's a game board. My vision of the world accepts that. This is not either or, it's both and, but says, no, but equally, particularly now, given globalization, it's a world that looks like not the map of those brightly colored squares, but think about a map of the world at night, where you just see light and darkness and all those lights are connected. Or think about a map of the internet, which is nothing but networks intertwined and interconnected. That world exists too, and it's the people-based world. It's the world you and I live in with all of our connections and our ability to make things happen. It's the world that global corporations are in. It's the world that civic groups, non-governmental groups, universities, churches, other religious institutions live in. It's also the world that global criminals live in. It's not just a happy world. And my argument is, if you don't see both at the same time, you are missing a critically important part of the picture. So I don't want to replace the chessboard with the web, but I want to say anyone who is thinking about global problems, global outcomes, how we survive and thrive, you had better factor in the web world alongside the chessboard world.
And walk us through the idea of the networks.
Yes.
Because a great part of the book is devoted to different types of networks, and you've sliced and diced it, and you come out of it with a 101 in network analysis, and it was incredibly instructive. But walk through the networks, and it's not just a function of the number of connections you have to a node that necessarily determines your influence. It's much more complex than that. So can you give a little sense of what makes a network more or less powerful?
Absolutely. And I realized that I also want to just talk for 1 second about what, in response to your point about transgovernmentalism, because that is very important. I did not invent the idea that we should not just look at the world in terms of unitary actor states. Go back to the 70s, go back to the 60s. In fact, the further back you go, people will tell you that the origin was further back than that. But what people talked about was transgovernmentalism, which meant parts of governments. So you had central bankers talking to each other. You had the G7, the G8, the G20. That was heads of state talking to each other, finance ministers talking to each other. Parts of government. That's the idea that instead of a whole state, different parts of government could act. And then in the 90s and the aughts, there was transnational relations, and that really is the same as the web world. I think you have done a lot of work with cities. That's actually an interesting combination. It's a governmental entity, but traditional international relations has no room for cities, and cities tend to work more with corporations and civic groups. So there's a direct line from transgovernmentalism to transnationalism to what I call the web world. I think it is easier just to start with the vision of a web. I think it's also, as we live on the internet, a very natural vision. But then why networks? Well, because that is the connected form. And a network is just a set of nodes and edges in fancy network theory terms. The rest of us would say, dots and lines, right? We are, you're a node and you're connected to other people. But what's important is it isn't just random connections. So if we think of the map of the internet, you will see billions of networks. What network theory does is to say, actually, who you're connected to and how you are connected to them, meaning the structure of a network, really matters in terms of how well that network works. So the standard network is a hub and spokes, right? There's the hub. If you think of your own social group, at least in your mind, probably you're the hub and all your friends are the spokes. That's a star network, a hub network. But then think about, well, actually, you could be a member of a small group that is connected to other small groups. That's more a pod network. The older people will remember a telephone tree where, it snows and everybody calls one person and that one person calls another small group. But it's a more decentralized network. And then finally, there's kind of a mesh network. Think about a hammock or a fishing net where there is no hub. There's not even pods. It's just everyone connected to everyone else. My point is, if we're in a networked world, in a web world, we need to think really systematically about who's connected to whom and how, because we need to be able to manipulate those networks.
Give an example. I mean, you give a couple of really, I think, interesting examples around, for example, the Global Alliance for Vaccination and Immunization. You've already referred to the sort of intercity collaborations, most notably around the C40 and the Paris Climate Agreement. Walk through kind of what made those kinds of examples stand out for you. I mean, and how do they explain how states and non-state actors and others work together to drive a particular policy agenda using kind of these principles of network based cooperation?
I think a good place to start is climate change, because it's very much on our agenda, and politically you can see the differences between the two worlds. The Paris Agreement is fundamentally from the chessboard world. It does make room for non-state actors, and that's relevant, but basically, as one of the participants in negotiations recently said to me, it was really about the key governments, and this person sort of said, and it was about the U.S. government under Obama, that made this happen. And there was a lot of non-governmental organizations and corporations, but that was sort of the noise. Secondary. The core was governments coming together and agreeing on a rolling set of targets. That's the chessboard view of the world, and it's important. I mean, we wouldn't have spent as much time as we have from Kyoto onward trying to get an agreement if it weren't important. But then Donald Trump pulls out of the Paris Agreement. And from a international global diplomacy point of view, that's really a tremendous blow, even though the pullout isn't effective yet. But the next day, the Michael Bloomberg and the C40, which are 40 cities that are important, but the Global Covenant of Mayors, that's 7,000 cities around the country. Just in the U.S., you had mayors, governors, university presidents, and CEOs the next day saying, we will negotiate with the United Nations to reduce emissions. That's webcraft. That's where individuals and institutions have agency and power on the global stage to make a difference. Now, the best is you have both, because yes, governments can do things and can impose taxes and enforce obligations in ways that private actors can't. On the other hand, even the most determined government is not going to be able to convince individual actors and businesses to do all the things they may want to do on their own. So the best is to have both. In that instance, the government cut out and the network stepped up.
And it's happening independent of centralized government.
Absolutely.
That's the point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the great thing is, Mayor Bloomberg was a mayor of a very important city in New York. But after that, he's a very wealthy person. He's got a foundation. But anybody could organize those cities. You could go to the Global Conference on Mayors. You could, anybody could organize a group of non-governmental organizations. Business, you can go to the Chamber of Commerce and try to organize business. So it creates much more agency without government.
And there's some issues, presumably, where that's not going to be as easily undertaken. So, for example, on, say, the big conventional weapons treaties, for example,
Yes.
or nuclear weapons, or even on terrorism, I suppose at one level, though you're seeing cities increasingly cooperating even on that front. Is webcraft more amenable in some issues than others? I mean,
I think it is. Although it reminds me that in the 60s and 70s, remember the various cities would say they were nuclear-free zones.
That's
I lived
right.
in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which was a nuclear-free zone. No one had really ever asked to store nuclear weapons in Cambridge, but even there, that clearly, if you're thinking about nuclear proliferation, I think most of us would say yes. You need governments there. Fundamental issues, for instance, on the high seas of war and peace, where states still control huge amounts of resources, those are going to be more chessboard issues. That said, the International Landmines Treaty was something the United States was very opposed to, as were other key states, and non-governmental organizations got a long way there. So even in that core, I wouldn't say there's no agency for the web world, but I would say that things like terrorism and any other kind of global crime, again, trafficking in drugs, in arms, in people, money laundering, even intellectual property piracy, you need corporations. You need who's enabling that. A lot of that illicit trade is tied up with licit trade, and you do need states to help regulate trade, but cities can play a very important role. Corporate groups can play a role, and NGOs can as well. On issues like climate, health, migration, all the issues that are directly affecting the quality of our lives, even if governments are totally on board, they need to be working with a raft of non-state actors or web actors. And I would say in many cases, web actors can actually catalyze action and carry it out.
what about the latest developments we're getting now from Facebook and Google and Twitter about the ways in which networks perhaps have been tweaked, to put it mildly, to shape preferences or nudge people in particular directions? I mean, when you wrote the book is very hopeful about the prospects of the net. I think you acknowledge that there's dangers of manipulation, especially with a higher level of the balkanization of the net.
Yes.
But more broadly, what are your reactions now? So the book was written in 2017, or it came out in 2017, given all that's come to light about some of these larger social media network platforms and the ways in which the network that was supposed to have been more transparent, open, and amenable to all seems to not be what it seems.
Right. Well, I definitely don't think networks are good or bad. And again, the most powerful global networks for many people are criminal and terrorist networks. So there's no, in some ways, we're just catching up. But I do think that now that I think about the negative impact of a social media platform, say, one way of understanding that is that a hostile power. So this, in this case, in some ways, it is the chessboard and the web. It's Russia acting as a state actor. That's not just random Russians who want to disrupt democracy in the United States and Canada and Western Europe. It's a state, but it's exploiting a platform and a set of algorithms to create networks that will actually exploit social division. And the way to think about it is Facebook has an algorithm that figures out who to connect you to based on your own likes. And in a way, they're enabling your network, because depending what they show you, that's what you click on, and that's who you are then connected to, and really connected. In Twitter, there are many people I met originally through Twitter, so that it's not just a digital connection. The Russians and others realizing that, then can exploit the fact that that algorithm is connecting you to people that they think you're going to like, and then build networks that radicalize you ever further by sowing social division that then has a very concrete impact. So that if we were to map Russian interference, what we might see is a bunch of American voters who were connected to people who thought like them, but the division between right and left is, there's a gap, but it's not that wide. After the Russians and others have manipulated that, the gap is much wider. You're connected to much more radical members of a network, and actually that has had a social division. So it is you can exploit the ways to connect people and whom you're connected to and how you're connected to them for good or ill. A large part of what I'm arguing about is learn this stuff and figure out how to do it for good.
Speaking of good, do you see some elements within the current or future administrations in the United States assuming or adopting elements of this webcraft? I mean, is this something, when you were in the State Department, did you see this kind of thinking becoming more common? And do you see this as something that perhaps a future administration might take on board more aggressively?
Secretary Clinton certainly got it loud and clear. In fact, she thought about it in network terms. One of the reasons she hired me to be director of policy planning is that I had written an article in 2009 that had talked about American power in a networked world. And she responded to that vision of America at the center of a lot of global networks. But she also just thought naturally about how to connect to people. So in the State Department, she created an ambassador to women, an ambassador to civil society, an ambassador for entrepreneurs, an ambassador to largely Muslim societies. So she just naturally thought not just in terms of state to state work, but how could we as the State Department reach out to what I would now call web actors. And we tried to institutionalize some of that, and we succeeded in some ways. I would not say John Kerry was as enthusiastic. He's a pretty traditional chessboard guy. And so I do think it's going to require very systematic thought and institutionalization, and you're going to get a lot of pushback from the chessboard players, the people who think, no, what we need is an assistant secretary and an ambassador, and sure, we can reach out to web actors, but that's what embassies are for, and a lot of it's public diplomacy. If you say to people, no, I actually want to empower diplomats, and I'm in quotes, whose job it is to create and connect to existing networks of different kinds of social and economic actors, that's a very new vision of what diplomacy is, and it's going to take some really far-sighted thinking and institutional reform to make that happen.
Do you see other countries taking on this vision at all successfully? I mean, and I'm curious also if you could just reflect on China in particular.
Yes. China is fascinating because China, is the Middle Kingdom.
Yes.
Right? The Middle Kingdom means the center of global networks, right? It was the hub of hubs, and it thought of everybody else in terms of tributary states. The job was to come and pay tribute, but it didn't just think about that again as it's an empire. It thought of it as networks of Chinese all over the world, and the overseas Chinese have been, merchants in many parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia. Today, China's One Belt, One Road is explicitly a network strategy. They are creating a physical network on land and on sea from China all the way through through Central Asia, through Southeast Asia, and to Europe. That will be a physical infrastructure that enables vast networks of relationships. And the United States had those relationships through our corporate activity, and through our civic groups, but we're not thinking about it in that systematic way. Europe is, and Canada is, I think, but probably less comprehensively, interestingly, than China is.
Walk through Canada. I mean, because Canada, there's a big thrust around public diplomacy,
Yes.
and emphasizing more Twitter use and Facebook use. But as you said, that's a pretty traditional form in a way of chesscraft. Right. How is Canada picking up the slack on this agenda? What do you see that Canada's doing right, and what could it do better?
So the Liberal Party before Prime Minister Trudeau was elected,
a long time ago,
right? I need to update it now with the Foreign Secretary, but. The Liberal Party had a sort of strategy agenda that sees the world very much in interconnected ways, again, cities and corporations and civic groups, and actually talked about power through influence and influence through connections. And there's an analogy here to all our personal lives, right? You think, who are influential people? They're the people who have connections. How do you get a job? You work your connections. And this is a vision of Canada as a smaller power, but a power that is a medium power. It's not a small power. It's a medium power that is well-liked and has tremendous reach through the Commonwealth, reach as an immigrant nation, reach as the North American nation that many countries would rather deal with.
Right now?
Right now, but even and so really talking about how do we build those connections. I'll have to round back to see how well that's being implemented, but I also think Canada, now 20 years ago, Canada came up with human security and really pushed it, Canada and Japan both. Also, even the idea of responsibility to protect, that's a notion about people. And so Canada has, I think, been at the forefront of pushing toward a world where we weren't only thinking about states, where we were also thinking about people. And Canada is well placed to operate in that networked world.
Let's step back for a second. Just looking at the big picture in terms of the global liberal order and where we're going, and with traditional statecraft and with webcraft. The United States was one of the architects, enablers of this global order since the mid-40s. And what we've seen now, as you yourself have written, is the withdrawal, in a way, of the United States from the global scenario. Right. And I guess my first question to you is, do you see the global liberal order as it stands surviving this withdrawal for a prolonged period of time? And even if it does survive a Trump administration, possibly two Trump administrations, not that I want to speculate too far ahead, what will the global liberal order come back to its current configuration, or is the world changing so dramatically that really its return won't make it necessarily a major difference? So where are we going with U.S. withdrawal currently, and what does a future global order look like with or even without the United States at its center?
I do not think we're going back to the shining vision of the post 1945 liberal international order. That is an artifact of 20th century politics. It's an artifact of World War II and the victors of World War II and the lessons of World War I and World War II. Terrible, terrible lessons that said the world will do better when states can come together, at least on areas of common interest. And it was not an idealist vision. The UN was created with Franklin Roosevelt understanding that you needed the 4 policemen at the table, ultimately the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. But it's a vision of the world with a fairly limited number of states and of course, really 2 blocks more than anything else. Those 2 blocks paralyzed its operation for many years during the Cold War, but there were times you could get everybody on side or somebody abstained and the UN could work. But also the economic order was mostly the Western order because the communist nations didn't play. And then after the Cold War, you have a decade where things really do look like they're working pretty well. That's also because the United States is a hyperpower during that decade. But there are just too many factors that require major evolution of that order. One is just rising and returning powers and in different configurations. So it's not 2 blocks anymore, but as Russia comes back, as China comes back, and I say comes back because they have, certainly in China's case, they were a great power long before the United States or North America was on the chessboard map.
That's right.
But powers like Iran too. I mean, it's not just China and Russia. Those factors mean the institutions that were premised on a sort of Western order are having to grapple with non-Western powers or non-democratic powers, depending how you want to think about it. But again, I also think that those were institutions set up for problems states were the primary actors on. If it were tariffs, well, yes, you need national governments. If it's arms, you need national governments. If it's just fundamental war and peace or imposing an ideology from top down, communism, capitalism, you needed governments. Today, if you said, what are the top 5 things that ought to be keeping governments and citizens up at night? I'm putting climate change and pandemics and terrorism and global criminal activity and migrants and refugees. Yes, I'm worried about nuclear proliferation too, but those are going to be high up on anybody's list. You would not create the United Nations or the World Bank or the IMF or the World Trade Organization or any of those subsidiary organizations to deal with that. So we're in a period where we have to evolve. We have to figure out how to connect those 2 worlds, the states that are still important. I'm not arguing states are disappearing. They're not. But the chessboard world and the web world, the powerful national governments alongside cities, networks of cities, and then again, citizens and corporations in ways that I can't tell you what it's going to look like, but I can tell you that I think the traditional institutions are going to look more like hubs of web networks than they are going to this kind of, I almost think of it as a Wizard of Oz institutional world driven by a small number of states.
Anne-Marie, thank you for connecting the nodes, the dots, the edges, and the lines. It's been really a pleasure having you here, and so looking forward to continuing this conversation down the road.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.